Imagine a time when people believed the earth was flat, cats were agents of the devil, and taking a bath was basically a death wish. Nothing like 1,000 years of history boiled down to castles, crusades, and complete scientific ignorance, right? Of course, because everyone knows peasants spent their days praying not to be burned at the stake for witchcraft. Or at least that's what the movies taught us. Let's dive into this magical journey through medieval myths that, spoiler alert, are about as real as dragons flying over feudal lands. The good news is that everything you think you know about the Middle Ages is fascinatingly wrong. The bad news is that your favorite medieval-themed movies, games, and Renaissance fairs have been lying to your face this whole time. That's right, that $12 turkey leg you gnawed on while watching fake knights joust was about as historically accurate as putting dinosaurs and humans in the same petting zoo. The Middle Ages, that delightful stretch of European history from roughly the 5th to the late 15th century, has been thoroughly misrepresented in popular culture. You'd think with 1,000 years of actual documented history, we wouldn't need to make stuff up, but apparently truth is less entertaining than watching Russell Crowe gallop around in historically suspect armor shouting about maximum things being maximized. But before you throw your ye old mead mug across the room in historical indignation, let's get one thing straight. The Middle Ages weren't all plague, mud, and religious fanaticism. I mean, there was plenty of that, don't get me wrong, but there was also innovation, art, and people who, shocking as it may seem, actually enjoyed their lives despite not having Wi-Fi or indoor plumbing. And speaking of plumbing, let's dive right into our first myth, which is literally about diving into things. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did actually bathe. I know. Everything you've learned from Hollywood suggests they were all walking around in a perpetual state of filth, their bodies caked with months of accumulated grime, their hair resembling something closer to a bird's nest than a human hairstyle. The reality? They were actually pretty concerned with cleanliness, just in ways that differed from our modern obsession with showering daily. Medieval folks had public bathhouses where people would gather not just to get clean, but to socialize, much like how we meet friends at coffee shops to overpay for beverages while pretending to work on our screenplays. These bathhouses were so popular that by the 13th century, Paris had 32 of them. That's right. Medieval Parisians were bathing communally while your ancestors in the 18th century were still covering up their stench with perfume instead of soap and water. The church sometimes frowned upon these establishments, not because cleanliness was considered ungodly, but because these bathhouses had a tendency to become places where people did more than just scrub behind their ears. Turns out that getting naked with strangers in a relaxing hot environment sometimes led to activities that didn't align with religious teachings. Who could have possibly predicted that? Of course, the frequency of bathing varied based on social class, geographical location, and personal preference. Much like today, where some of us shower twice daily, while others consider a splash of cologne over yesterday's sweat to be adequate hygiene. Peasants might wash their faces and hands daily, while saving full-body immersion for special occasions or weekly rituals. The wealthy, meanwhile, could afford private baths in their homes, complete with servants to heat and carry the water. And they didn't just soak in plain water. They added herbs, flowers, and oils to create pleasant scents and supposed health benefits. Medieval aromatherapy, if you will. So next time you drop $30 on a fancy bath bomb that turns your tub into a glittery purple lagoon, remember you're participating in a tradition that goes back centuries. The idea that medieval people were perpetually filthy likely stems from the early modern period, when medical theories actually discouraged bathing. Physicians in the 16th and 17th centuries believed that water, especially hot water, opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body. This was particularly concerning during plague outbreaks. So ironically, people in the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods, those supposedly more advanced eras, were often significantly less clean than their medieval counterparts. It's a bit like how your grandparents who grew up without the internet can somehow program a VCR better than your tech-obsessed cousin who has never known life without YouTube. Progress isn't always linear, and sometimes we get things spectacularly wrong before we get them right again. Even medieval monks, those supposedly austere fellows we imagine spending their days copying manuscripts and flagellating themselves, had regulations for regular bathing in their monastic rules. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, specified that monks should bathe on a regular schedule, though admittedly not too frequently. To the healthy, and especially to the young, bathing shall seldom be permitted. It states, which doesn't sound great until you realize that seldom, in this context, still meant more often than many people bathe in certain modern music festival settings. And unlike those festival goers, medieval monks weren't paying $15 for a bottle of water while standing in a field of questionable substances. They had clean, running water systems in many monasteries, including elaborate plumbing for waste disposal. Medieval castles, contrary to being the drafty, primitive fortresses we often imagine, frequently had designated areas for bathing and relatively sophisticated toilet systems called garderobes. These were essentially toilet seats built into castle walls with shafts that deposited waste outside, often into a moat or river. Not exactly environmentally friendly by today's standards, but significantly more advanced than the chamber pot under the bed that would become common in later centuries. And while we're on the subject of castle amenities, many had specially designed washing areas where inhabitants could clean themselves. The notion that medieval nobility were content to sit in their own filth while dressed in elaborate, expensive clothing is about as logical as thinking modern celebrities never shower between red carpet appearances. In fact, medieval people had entire professions dedicated to cleanliness. There were bath attendants, launderers, and even perfumers who made their living helping others stay fresh. Medieval medical texts frequently emphasized the importance of cleanliness for health, with the 12th century medical school at Salerno recommending regular washing of hands, face, and teeth. Yes, medieval people even brushed their teeth, though not with the minty fresh fluoride concoctions we use today. Instead, they used cloths, various herbs, and sometimes abrasive substances like salt or crushed shells. Their dental hygiene wasn't perfect by modern standards, but they weren't all walking around with blackened stumps for teeth either, at least not until sugar became more widely available in later centuries and started rotting everyone's molars regardless of their hygiene habits. Literature from the medieval period also gives us clues about their bathing habits. In the 14th century poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, our hero is described as being bathed and groomed before meeting with his host's wife. Knights in romance literature are frequently described as washing before meals or after journeys. These weren't just fantasy elements. They reflected real social expectations. Imagine if our modern action heroes were regularly depicted brushing their teeth or applying deodorant between fight scenes. These mundane activities are generally omitted from our storytelling, not because they don't happen, but because they're assumed. Similarly, medieval literature mentioned bathing because it was a normal part of life, not because it was an unusual luxury. So why does this myth about medieval filth persist? Partly because it allows us to feel superior to our ancestors, to imagine that we've progressed so far beyond their primitive ways. There's something comforting about believing that people in the past were universally miserable, dirty, and ignorant. It makes our own era seem like the pinnacle of human achievement rather than just another chapter in a very long story. It's the historical equivalent of looking at someone else's mess of a life and thinking, well, at least I'm doing better than that guy. But the truth is that humans throughout history have generally tried to make the best of their circumstances, developing sophisticated systems and practices that made sense within their own cultural contexts and technological limitations. Medieval Europeans also understood the connection between cleanliness and health, even if they didn't have germ theory to explain exactly why dirt and disease were often connected. During the Black Death, physicians recommended frequent washing and changing of clothes as preventative measures. They got the mechanism wrong. They thought bad smells carried disease rather than understanding the role of fleas and bacteria. But the practical advice wasn't too far off. Clean people generally got sick less often, even if no one quite understood why. It's a bit like how your friend who swears by their bizarre morning wellness ritual involving apple cider vinegar and chanting might actually be healthier, but probably not for the reasons they think. Sometimes you can get the right answer, even with completely wrong reasoning. Now, let's move on from splashing around in medieval bathwater to our second favorite misconception. The so-called Dark Ages were an intellectual wasteland where science and learning withered and died, suffocated by religious dogma and superstition. According to popular imagination, the medieval period was when humanity collectively decided to take a 1,000-year nap, putting all intellectual progress on pause until the Renaissance came along to wake everyone up with a splash of enlightened thinking. This narrative is about as accurate as claiming that people in the 1990s only communicated via slap bracelets and Tamagotchis. The reality is far more complex and, frankly, a lot more interesting than the simplistic religion versus reason dichotomy that gets tossed around in sophomore philosophy classes and History Channel specials. For starters, the term Dark Ages itself is problematic and largely abandoned by serious historians. Originally coined during the Renaissance as a way for scholars to distance themselves from their immediate predecessors, the scholarly equivalent of a teenager claiming their parents just don't understand. The term has stuck around in popular culture despite being about as useful for understanding medieval history as a chocolate teapot is for serving Earl Grey. The period was dark primarily to later historians who struggled to find sources, not because everyone was stumbling around in intellectual darkness waiting for Galileo and Leonardo da Vinci to flip on the light switch. And even the source problem has been largely addressed as archaeologists and historians have uncovered and translated more texts and artifacts from the period. The medieval period actually saw numerous scientific and technological advancements that transformed European society and laid groundwork for later developments. Take, for example, the humble yet revolutionary heavy plow, which allowed farmers to cultivate the dense, fertile soils of northern Europe for the first time. This agricultural innovation increased food production so dramatically that it supported population growth and urbanization throughout the medieval period. But I suppose the agricultural technology advancement period doesn't have quite the same ominous ring as the Dark Ages, so here we are. Similarly, the medieval period gave us the mechanical clock, eyeglasses, the blast furnace, the spinning wheel, and significant improvements in shipbuilding and navigation. Not exactly the technological stagnation we've been led to believe. Universities as we know them today were born in the medieval period, with institutions like Bologna, founded 1088, Oxford established by 1096, and Paris, founded around 1150, becoming centers of learning and intellectual debate. These weren't small, obscure operations either. By the late medieval period, some universities had thousands of students. And contrary to the notion that the church stifled learning, most of these institutions were founded with ecclesiastical support and were staffed largely by clergy. The curriculum included the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, providing students with a well-rounded education that would make today's hyper-specialized degrees look narrow by comparison. And yes, they had student loan debt too, though presumably without the convenient online payment portals we have today. Medieval scholars were not intellectual lightweights. They grappled with complex philosophical and scientific questions, developed sophisticated logical systems, and preserved and built upon the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. Figures like Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, Robert Grosseteste, and Nicole Oersma made significant contributions to fields ranging from optics to physics to natural philosophy. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, advocated for empirical methods and scientific inquiry centuries before the so-called scientific revolution. He wrote about flying machines, motorized ships, and submarines in an era when most people's idea of advanced transportation was a slightly better horse. Meanwhile, your local weather app still can't tell you accurately whether you need an umbrella tomorrow. The church, far from being uniformly opposed to scientific inquiry, was often its greatest patron. The medieval worldview saw the study of nature as a way to better understand God's creation. As Aquinas put it, The knowledge of God is the ultimate end of all human knowledge and activity. This perspective motivated rather than hindered scientific investigation. The calendar, astronomy, and mathematics were all advanced by clergy trying to better understand the world God had created and to accurately calculate important religious dates like Easter. It's similar to how modern tech companies sometimes make important scientific breakthroughs while trying to figure out better ways to sell us things we don't need. The motivation might be specific, but the knowledge gained can be broadly valuable. Medieval universities had extensive libraries where ancient texts were preserved, studied, and commented upon. The famous school of Chartres in the 12th century was renowned for its work in natural philosophy, while monastic scriptoria painstakingly copied manuscripts that would otherwise have been lost to history. The massive translation movement of the 12th and 13th centuries centered particularly in Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars interacted, brought previously unknown Greek and Arabic texts to Western Europe, sparking intellectual revolutions in multiple fields. Works by Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and many others were translated and circulated widely, often with extensive commentaries that expanded upon the original ideas. It's rather like how your friend shares articles on social media with "this is important" added at the top, except medieval commentators actually read the material first. Medical knowledge, though certainly lacking by modern standards, was more sophisticated than popular depictions suggest. The medical school at Salerno was teaching human anatomy based on pig dissections due to restrictions on human dissection as early as the 11th century. By the late medieval period, some universities had obtained papal permission to dissect human cadavers for educational purposes. Surgeons performed complex operations, including cataract removal, trephination, drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, and amputation with cauterization to prevent bleeding. They developed specialized tools and techniques, many of which evolved into the instruments used in modern surgery. Anesthesia consisted of alcoholic beverages, opium derivatives, and herbs like mandrake and hemlock, a cocktail that makes modern patients' complaints about hospital food seem rather quaint by comparison. The scientific method, as we understand it today, has roots in medieval scholarly practices. Robert Grosseteste, a 13th century bishop of Lincoln, developed a framework for scientific inquiry based on observation, hypothesis formation, and experimental verification centuries before Francis Bacon is credited with similar ideas. Grosseteste's work on optics and light included experimental verification of his theoretical models. His student, Roger Bacon, expanded on these methodological approaches, emphasizing the importance of mathematics in scientific inquiry and conducting experiments on the properties of light and vision. Bacon even described the principles of telescope and microscope construction, though the technology to create effective versions of these instruments wouldn't exist until centuries later. It's like how Leonardo da Vinci sketched helicopters but lacked the engines to make them actually fly. The intellectual framework was there, waiting for technology to catch up. Mathematical innovation flourished in medieval Europe, particularly after the introduction of Arabic numerals, which actually originated in India, replaced the cumbersome Roman numeral system. Fibonacci, whose famous sequence appears throughout nature, introduced these numerals to Europe in his 1202 book Liber Abaci, revolutionizing calculation methods. The development of algebra advanced significantly, and medieval scholars made important contributions to trigonometry and geometry. Universities taught computational astronomy that allowed for the prediction of planetary positions and eclipses with reasonable accuracy. They weren't sending rovers to Mars, but they could tell you when to expect a solar eclipse without having to check NASA's website, which is more than most of us can do today without our smartphones. The medieval period also saw significant advances in logical reasoning and argument. Scholastic disputation, a formalized method of debate where scholars would defend positions against objections, developed rigorous standards for evidence and logical consistency. While we might chuckle at questions like how many angels can dance on the head of pin, which, by the way, wasn't actually a common medieval debate topic, the methodologies developed to address complex theological questions created intellectual tools that would later be applied to scientific inquiry. It's similar to how internet arguments about whether a hot dog is a sandwich might seem trivial, but they often involve surprisingly sophisticated applications of definition, categorization, and logical reasoning. The difference is that medieval scholars wrote their arguments in Latin treatises rather than all-caps Twitter posts. The technological innovations of the medieval period transformed daily life in ways that laid groundwork for later developments. Water power was harnessed through increasingly sophisticated mill designs, providing energy for everything from grinding grain to fulling cloth to powering bellows for blast furnaces. By the end of the medieval period, complex mechanical devices like weight-driven clocks with escapement mechanisms were being constructed across Europe. These weren't just practical tools. They represented a new way of conceptualizing and measuring time itself, shifting from the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset to the mechanical precision of hours and minutes. This mechanization of time measurement would later have profound implications for scientific observation, labor organization, and even religious practices. It was the medieval equivalent of how smartphones have changed our relationship with both time and space, except with fewer notification pings and more giant wooden gears. So why has this myth of medieval intellectual stagnation persisted? Partly because of Renaissance self-promotion. The scholars of the 14th to 16th centuries deliberately positioned themselves as rediscovering classical knowledge after a long, dark age, even though they were building directly on medieval foundations. Partly it's due to anti-religious sentiment during the Enlightenment, which portrayed the church as an enemy of reason rather than one of its medieval patrons. And partly it's just a good story. The narrative of humanity emerging from darkness into light makes for better television than the reality of gradual, complex intellectual evolution with contributions from diverse sources. It's the historical equivalent of a makeover show. The before has to look sufficiently awful for the after to seem impressive, regardless of what reality actually looked like. Next time you hear someone dismissing the Middle Ages as a time of intellectual darkness, remember that these were the people who gave us universities, hospitals, mechanical clocks, and the foundations of modern science. They weren't just sitting around waiting for the Renaissance to happen. They were actively creating the conditions that made later scientific advances possible. The scholars of medieval Europe might not have had Google, but they asked profound questions about the natural world and developed sophisticated methods to answer them. They worked within their cultural framework rather than against it, finding ways to integrate faith and reason rather than seeing them as inherently opposed. In many ways, their approach was more holistic than our modern tendency to compartmentalize knowledge into strictly separated disciplines. Myth number 3. Everyone in medieval Europe died young, usually by age 30, because life was brutal, short, and filled with plagues, wars, and general misery. We've all heard some version of this claim, usually accompanied by dramatic sighs of relief that we weren't born back then. Can you imagine only living to 30? Your friend might ask while sipping an overpriced coffee drink with enough sugar to make a medieval physician faint in horror. The truth? Medieval life expectancy statistics are about as misleading as those 9 out of 10 dentists recommend claims for toothpaste. Yes, the average life expectancy was around 30 to 35 years. But that number is dramatically skewed by high infant and childhood mortality rates, not because adults were dropping dead the moment they hit their 3rd decade. If a medieval person survived childhood, and many did, they could reasonably expect to live into their 60s or 70s, not radically different from modern times before the medical advances of the 20th century. When historians examine skeletal remains or documentary evidence like tax rolls, court records, and guild documents, they consistently find plenty of people living to what we would consider a normal old age. The 14th century English poet Geoffrey Chaucer died at 60. Eleanor of Aquitaine lived to 82. The Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo was actively leading military campaigns during the Fourth Crusade when he was in his 90s, putting your grandpa's boast about still mowing his own lawn at 75 into perspective. Age wasn't seen as the enemy it is today. Gray hair was respected as a sign of wisdom rather than something to be frantically covered up with chemicals every 6 weeks. The high average mortality rate was driven largely by the shocking number of children who died before reaching adulthood. Approximately 30% of infants didn't survive their first year, and nearly half of all children died before age 10, primarily from diseases that are now preventable or treatable: measles, smallpox, dysentery, various respiratory infections. These tragic statistics drag down the average life expectancy considerably. It's a bit like calculating the average driving experience in a room where half the people are infants who can't drive at all. Technically accurate, but not particularly useful for understanding how long experienced drivers have been on the road. If you made it to adulthood in medieval Europe, you weren't living on borrowed time. You had decent odds of becoming the crotchety old person complaining about how young people were ruining everything with their newfangled printing presses and fancy pointed shoes. Medieval people were also not dropping like flies from plague throughout the entire period. The Black Death, while undeniably catastrophic, was concentrated primarily in the years of 1347 to 1351, with subsequent smaller outbreaks. The disease killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population, a devastatingly high number, but that still means 2/3 survived. And the 1,000-year medieval period had many generations that never experienced plague at all. It's a bit like characterizing modern life solely by the COVID-19 pandemic, as if that's all that ever happens in our era. Serious as the plague was, medieval Europeans also had centuries without it, during which they managed to build cathedrals, create art, fall in love, argue with their neighbors, and engage in all the other activities that make up human existence. War, while certainly present throughout the medieval period, wasn't the constant state of affairs we often imagine either. Yes, there were significant conflicts like the 100 Years' War between England and France, but these weren't continuous battles. They included long stretches of peace interrupted by relatively brief campaigns. Most medieval people would have experienced war much like modern civilians in peaceful countries do, as something that happened elsewhere, affected their taxes, and potentially took away young men from their communities, but didn't directly threaten their day-to-day existence. The image of peasants constantly fleeing marauding armies or having their villages burned is largely a product of dramatic depictions in film and television rather than historical reality. Medieval armies were generally too small and too seasonal to create the kind of perpetual warfare we imagine. Medieval medical care, while primitive by modern standards, wasn't entirely useless either. Practitioners had effective herbal remedies for pain relief, wound cleaning, and treating common ailments. Willow bark, containing the same active ingredient as aspirin, was widely used for pain and fever. Honey, with its antibacterial properties, was applied to wounds to prevent infection. Monasteries maintained herb gardens specifically for medicinal purposes, and many treatments were surprisingly effective based on centuries of observation and experimentation. The medical texts of Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, included treatments that modern research has shown to have legitimate therapeutic value. They didn't have MRIs or antibiotics, but medieval healers weren't just waving chicken feet over patients while chanting nonsense. They were applying the best knowledge available to them, which sometimes worked quite well. Diet and nutrition for most medieval people were also better than commonly portrayed. The typical peasant diet was primarily plant-based, centered on whole grain breads, pottages, thick, hearty stews, vegetables, and fruits in season. This high-fiber, varied diet was in many ways healthier than the heavily processed, sugar-laden food many modern people consume. Protein came from eggs, cheese, occasional meat, particularly during feast days, and fish in coastal or riverine areas. While famines did occur, particularly after crop failures, they were periodic disasters rather than the constant state of affairs. Medieval agricultural systems, with their crop rotation and community governance of farming practices, were remarkably sustainable and generally provided adequate nutrition for the population. Your medieval peasant might not have had access to out-of-season strawberries in December, but they weren't typically suffering from the obesity, diabetes, and heart disease that plague modern societies either. Dental health provides another interesting window into medieval lifespans and quality of life. Examinations of medieval skeletons show that while dental issues like cavities and abscesses certainly existed, they were less common than in later centuries when sugar became widely available. The coarser, whole-grain diet actually helped clean teeth through abrasion, and the absence of refined sugar meant less decay. Teeth did wear down over time from the coarse bread that contained small stone particles from millstones. But this gradual was less immediately threatening to health than the rapid decay caused by modern sugar consumption. Many medieval people reached old age with most of their teeth intact, something that became increasingly rare in the 17th to 19th centuries as sugar consumption rose dramatically. It's one of history's little ironies that in this particular aspect of health, the supposedly more advanced post-medieval periods actually saw a decline. Medieval communities also had social support systems that helped people survive in old age. Extended family networks, guilds, parishes, and religious institutions all provided forms of assistance for the elderly, orphaned, widowed, or disabled. Monasteries served as retirement homes for some elderly people who would donate their property in exchange for care for the remainder of their lives. Guild systems included provisions for supporting elderly members who could no longer work, as well as the widows and children of deceased members. While these systems weren't as comprehensive as modern social security or pension plans, they ensured that old age wasn't automatically a sentence to abandonment or poverty. In many ways, medieval communities took better care of their elderly than our modern individualistic society does, where isolation among the elderly has become a recognized public health crisis. The medieval period also wasn't the time of constant famine and starvation we often imagine. Agricultural innovations like the heavy plow, horse collar, crop rotation, and water mills increased food production significantly. Most famines were regional rather than continent-wide, and were typically caused by specific events like unusual weather patterns, plant diseases, or military conflicts disrupting farming. The Little Ice Age that began in the 14th century did create more challenging growing conditions, but medieval societies adapted with different crop varieties and farming techniques. They didn't have modern transportation networks to quickly move food from surplus to deficit areas, which made local crop failures more dangerous, but they did have storage systems and community practices designed to mitigate risk. The stereotype of the perpetually starving medieval peasant is about as accurate as thinking everyone in America eats nothing but fast food. Work conditions and labor practices in medieval Europe might surprise modern observers too. The medieval calendar included numerous religious feast days, anywhere from 40 to 150 days per year, depending on the region and period, during which work was prohibited or reduced. The concept of the weekend didn't exist, but the numerous saints' days, religious festivals, and seasonal celebrations created a work rhythm that included significant time off. Workdays followed the sun, meaning shorter hours in winter and longer in summer. But averaging across the year, many medieval workers put in fewer hours than modern Americans with their 40-plus hour work weeks and limited vacation time. Guild regulations protected workers from excessive demands, setting standards for working conditions, wages, and apprenticeship terms. Labor wasn't easy. It was often physically demanding in ways our service economy jobs aren't. But it wasn't the unrelenting grind portrayed in popular media either. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people found meaning, purpose, and joy in their lives despite the challenges they faced. Religious faith provided comfort and a framework for understanding hardship, while community celebrations, seasonal festivals, and family relationships offered genuine happiness. Art, music, storytelling, and games were integral parts of medieval life at all social levels. They celebrated births, marriages, and harvests. They mourned their dead with dignity and ritual. They fell in love, argued, reconciled, and experienced the full range of human emotions. The medieval period wasn't a 1,000-year stretch of unrelenting misery that people merely endured. It was simply life, with all its complexities, sorrows, and joys, lived in a different context than our own. Their expectations and measures of happiness differed from ours, but their capacity for joy and fulfillment did not. So why does this myth about medieval life being nasty, brutish and short persist? Partly because it makes us feel better about our own mortality. If we can tell ourselves that people in the past barely made it to 30, our modern lifespans seem like an impressive achievement rather than the biological norm for our species. Partly it stems from misinterpreting statistics without understanding what average life expectancy actually measures. And partly it's because focusing on the dramatic aspects of medieval life, the plagues, the battles, the occasional witch burning, makes for more exciting storytelling than acknowledging that most people spent their days farming, crafting, trading, and raising families in relatively stable communities. The extraordinary events that occupy a paragraph in a history textbook might have been a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence for the people who lived through them, not their daily reality. Let's move on to myth number 4. Medieval food was bland, boring, and unseasoned, consisting primarily of gruel and tough meat, until Marco Polo heroically returned from China with magical spices to save European cuisine from eternal blandness. This misconception is so deeply embedded in our collective imagination that it's practically a reflexive response. Mention medieval food, and someone will inevitably grimace and make a joke about tasteless gruel or meat so heavily spiced it was rotting. As with many historical misconceptions, the truth is both more complex and more interesting than the myth, and in this case, significantly more delicious. Medieval European cuisine was sophisticated, varied, and extremely well seasoned, with spice combinations and flavor profiles that might surprise modern palates accustomed to more standardized tastes. For starters, the idea that Europeans had no access to spices before Marco Polo's journeys in the late 13th century is completely false. Spices have been flowing into Europe from Asia and the Middle East since ancient Roman times, though the trade routes and volumes fluctuated with political circumstances. By the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, European markets were already well supplied with a wide range of imported spices including pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, and saffron. These weren't just available to the ultra-wealthy either. Merchant and artisan households regularly purchased spices, and even peasant households might splurge on small amounts for special occasions. Medieval account books, cookbooks, and household inventories all attest to the widespread use of spices throughout society, though certainly in different quantities depending on one's wealth and social status. Medieval cuisine actually used spices far more lavishly than we do today, particularly in wealthy households where elaborate spice combinations were a mark of sophistication and status. A typical aristocratic dish might combine cinnamon, ginger, cloves, grains of paradise, a pepper-like spice, saffron, and nutmeg in quantities that would make a modern chef clutch their pearls in horror. The 14th century English cookbook, The Famille of Curry, includes recipes calling for white and red wine, vinegar, verjuice, juice from unripe grapes or crab apples, almond milk, and dozens of herbs and spices. Medieval cuisine favored complex, layered flavors with sweet, sour, and savory notes combined in ways that modern Western cooking traditions generally avoid. Imagine biting into a meat pie flavored with cinnamon, ginger, and raisins, or a chicken dish cooked with saffron, almonds, and sugar. These were standard fare for medieval feast tables, not exotic experiments. The idea that medieval people used heavy spicing to cover the taste of rotten meat is another persistent myth that makes little historical sense. Spices were expensive, far too costly to waste on meat that had gone bad. A household that could afford abundant spices could certainly afford fresh meat, and one that couldn't afford fresh meat definitely couldn't afford imported spices either. Medieval people understood food spoilage perfectly well and had numerous preservation methods, including smoking, salting, pickling, and drying. They also had functioning noses and taste buds, contrary to popular belief, and weren't keen on eating rotting food any more than we are today. The heavy use of spices in medieval cuisine was about preference, fashion, and demonstrating wealth, not disguising spoilage. It's rather like how some modern restaurants garnish dishes with gold leaf, not because the food tastes bad without it, but because it signals luxury and refinement to a certain clientele. Medieval cookbooks reveal a cuisine far more varied, and sophisticated than the bland gruel of popular imagination. The surviving recipe collections, primarily representing elite cooking traditions, include instructions for hundreds of different dishes: fritters, tarts, stews, roasted meats, fish prepared dozens of ways, elaborate sauces, and complex desserts. Le Viandier, attributed to Guillaume Tirole, also known as Taillevent, chef to the French court in the 14th century, contains approximately 220 recipes. The Famille of Curry, compiled by the master cooks of Richard II around 1390, includes about 196 recipes. These weren't just minor variations on the same few dishes either. They represent distinct preparations requiring different techniques and ingredients. Medieval cooks were creating culinary art, not just meeting basic nutritional needs. The presentation of food was also highly elaborate in wealthy medieval households. Dishes might be colored with natural ingredients like saffron, yellow, spinach, green, or alkanet, red. Foods were often gilded with actual gold leaf or decorated with silver. Elaborate subtleties, decorative, often non-edible showpieces made of sugar, marzipan, or wax, were displayed between courses at feasts, sometimes depicting scenes from history, mythology, or religious stories. Peacocks might be redressed in their own feathers after cooking, complete with gold-painted beaks. A particularly spectacular presentation involved placing live birds inside a pie crust to fly out when the pie was cut open. Yes, 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie was based on an actual medieval culinary practice, though the birds weren't actually baked but inserted after cooking. Modern Instagram food influencers have nothing on medieval feast presentation. Even everyday peasant cooking, while certainly simpler than aristocratic cuisine, wasn't limited to bland gruel. The typical peasant diet centered on bread, pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally meat, dairy products, and seasonal fruits and vegetables. Pottage was flavored with whatever herbs were available: onions, garlic, leeks, parsley, sage, thyme, and many others grew readily in garden plots. Pottage wasn't one dish, but a category. It might be made with different grains, barley, oats, rye, different vegetables depending on the season, and different flavorings. It was the medieval equivalent of the modern bowl trend, a versatile, adaptable dish that changed with available ingredients. And bread, the staff of life in medieval Europe, came in many varieties beyond the basic brown loaf we might imagine. There were fine white breads, enriched breads with milk and eggs, flatbreads, and various regional specialties. Medieval people also enjoyed a wide variety of drinks beyond the small beer that everyone associates with the period. Yes, they drank beer and ale, the distinction being that ale was made without hops, but also wine, mead, fermented honey, cider, perry, fermented pear juice, and various herbal infusions. Hippocras, a spiced wine often served at the beginning or end of a feast, combined wine with cinnamon, ginger, grains of paradise, and sugar. Essentially a medieval mulled wine. Clare was a similar drink, made with honey rather than sugar. And contrary to popular belief, they had clean water too. Most communities had wells or springs providing fresh water, and water consumption was common, particularly among the lower classes who couldn't always afford alcoholic alternatives. The idea that medieval people never drank water is yet another myth that falls apart under historical scrutiny. Fasting practices in the medieval church, far from limiting culinary creativity, actually expanded it. On fast days, which could comprise nearly half the year, when all the various religious observances were counted, meat, dairy, and sometimes eggs were prohibited. This led to an incredible variety of fish dishes and plant-based alternatives. Almond milk became a staple substitute for dairy, used in cooking everything from blancmange, a creamy pudding, to mock eggs made from almond milk, saffron, and fish roe. Elaborate seafood dishes proliferated, and meat dishes were adapted with fish substitutions. Medieval cooks developed imitation eggs, imitation bacon, and even imitation venison made from whale meat, which counted as fish for fasting purposes due to living in the sea. Rather than restricting culinary expression, fasting regulations inspired creative workarounds that expanded the medieval recipe repertoire significantly. The vegetables available to medieval Europeans were also more varied than commonly believed. While they didn't have New World introductions like tomatoes, potatoes, or bell peppers, they cultivated carrots, turnips, parsnips, various cabbages, onions, garlic, leeks, beets, peas, beans, asparagus, artichokes, and numerous leafy greens. Fruits included apples, pears, plums, cherries, quinces, medlars, and now uncommon fruit that was extremely popular in medieval cuisine: strawberries, raspberries, and in southern regions, citrus and figs. Gardens were essential components of both rural and urban households, providing fresh produce as well as herb for both culinary and medicinal uses. The medieval diet, particularly for common people, was far more plant-based than our modern stereotype suggests. Desserts and sweets in medieval Europe were sophisticated and varied, particularly for the wealthy. Sugar, while expensive, was available and used for medicinal as well as culinary purposes. Honey was more common and featured in many sweet preparations. Custards, tarts, fritters, and various sweet pastries appear frequently in medieval cookbooks. Marzipan, made from ground almonds and sugar, was shaped into elaborate forms for special occasions. Gingerbread, not the cookie-like version we know today, but a spiced honey sweet, was popular throughout the period. And wafers, thin cookies made in decorated irons similar to modern pizzelle or crumb cake, were served at the end of feasts, often accompanied by spiced wine or sweet cordials. The medieval sweet tooth was well developed long before the Industrial Revolution made sugar cheap and abundant. So why has this myth about bland, horrible medieval food persisted? Partly because it fits neatly into a broader narrative of historical progress. The idea that everything, including food, has been on a steady upward trajectory of improvement. Partly because the actual flavor combinations of medieval cuisine are so different from modern Western taste preferences that they seem alien and unappetizing to contemporary palates. And partly because it's easier to make jokes about peasants eating gruel than to engage with the complex, sophisticated culinary traditions that actually existed. Modern chefs and food historians who have recreated medieval recipes often find them delicious, if unexpected, rich with spices, combining sweet and savory elements in ways that challenge our more compartmentalized approach to flavor. The fifth myth we'll skewer today is the notion that medieval Europeans believed the world was flat, and that Columbus heroically proved them wrong by not sailing off the edge of the earth. This misconception is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it's routinely trotted out as evidence of medieval ignorance and superstition, supposedly demonstrating how religion squashed scientific understanding until brave Renaissance explorers challenged church dogma. There's just one tiny problem with this narrative. It's completely, utterly, embarrassingly false. Medieval Europeans knew perfectly well that the earth was round. The sphericity of the earth was common knowledge among educated people throughout the medieval period, had been established by ancient Greek astronomers, and was never disputed by the medieval church. The flat earth myth says far more about modern misconceptions of the Middle Ages than it does about medieval understanding of cosmology. The ancient Greeks had already conclusively demonstrated the Earth's spherical shape through multiple lines of evidence. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, noted that during lunar eclipses, the Earth's shadow on the moon is always curved, which could only happen if the Earth were a sphere. He also observed that when sailing south, new stars become visible above the southern horizon, while northern stars disappear. Again, only possible on a spherical Earth. Eratosthenes, 276 to 194 BC, even calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy by measuring shadow lengths in different cities at the same time. These findings weren't lost or rejected during the medieval period. They were preserved, taught, and built upon in medieval universities. The 13th century astronomical textbook On the Sphere by Johannes de Sacrobosco, which clearly described a spherical Earth, was used in universities throughout Europe for hundreds of years. Medieval scholars not only knew the Earth was round, but were also remarkably accurate about its size. The measurements of Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference to within about 10 to 15% of the modern value. were known to medieval scholars through texts preserved and translated in the Islamic world. In fact, Columbus's famous voyage was controversial not because people thought he'd sail off the edge of the world, but because scholars correctly believed he had drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference. Columbus calculated that Japan would be about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands, while the actual distance is about 12,000 miles. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, Columbus and his crew would have died at sea long before reaching Asia. The real intellectual error of 1492 belonged to Columbus, not to his critics who actually had more accurate geographic knowledge. The sphericity of the Earth appears in numerous medieval artworks, texts, and maps. The famous Mappa Mundi, world maps, often show the Earth as circular, but this represents a two-dimensional projection of a sphere, not a flat Earth concept. Similar to how we might look at a flat map of the world today while still understanding that the Earth is round. The 13th century theological work on the properties of things by Bartholomeus Anglicus explicitly describes the Earth as a sphere at the center of the cosmos. King Alfred the Great's 9th century translation of Boethius refers to the Earth as a ball. The 7th century encyclopedia of Isidore of Seville, one of the most widely copied texts of the medieval period, clearly states that the Earth is round. Even Bede, writing in the 8th century, composed a work titled On the Reckoning of Time that discusses the spherical nature of the Earth as common knowledge. The idea that medieval Europeans believed in a flat Earth is actually a 19th century fabrication, largely popularized by Washington Irving's 1828 book, The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, which included a highly fictionalized account of Columbus defending the sphericity of the Earth against ignorant, superstitious Catholic authorities. This fictional scene, along with similar anti-Catholic and anti-medieval sentiments from other 19th century writers, became absorbed into popular consciousness and eventually textbooks. It served a narrative of the conflict thesis between science and religion that was fashionable in the 19th century but has since been largely abandoned by historians of science. The flat Earth myth provided a convenient but historically inaccurate example of religious ignorance being corrected by scientific observation. A story that appealed to 19th century sensibilities but bears little relation to medieval reality. The medieval understanding of cosmology was actually quite sophisticated, though based on different premises than our modern perspective. The prevailing Ptolemaic model placed the Earth at the center of the universe, with celestial bodies moving in complex combinations of circular orbits called epicycles. This geocentric model was mathematically complex and allowed for remarkably accurate predictions of planetary positions and celestial events. It wasn't rejected because of religious dogma or ignorance, but because it was the best explanation for the observational evidence available at the time. Without telescopes or modern measuring instruments, the apparent motion of the stars and planets is entirely consistent with them revolving around the Earth. The heliocentric model didn't triumph because people suddenly became smarter or less religious, but because new observational tools and mathematical techniques made it a more elegant explanation for an expanded set of data. Medieval astronomers made significant contributions to understanding celestial mechanics, often working within religious institutions that supported and funded their research. They created detailed astronomical tables predicting planetary positions, compiled star catalogs, and designed precise astronomical instruments. The Alphonsine tables, created under the patronage of Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century, were the most accurate astronomical tables available in Europe until Kepler's work in the 17th century. The astrolabe, an analog computer used to solve problems relating to time and the position of the sun and stars, was refined and widely used throughout medieval Europe. University curricula included astronomy as part of the quadrivium, and scholarly debates about celestial mechanics were common. These aren't the activities of a civilization that thought the world was flat or that the sky was a solid dome with stars stuck to it. The confusion about medieval beliefs regarding the Earth's shape may partly stem from conflating the physical understanding of the world with symbolic religious representations. Medieval artwork often used symbolic rather than realistic depictions. showing the Earth as a flat disk or square in religious contexts because these shapes had symbolic meaning, not because artists or viewers thought the physical Earth was actually shaped that way. This would be like future historians looking at our bathroom signs with stick figures and concluding that 21st century humans thought people were actually built like matchsticks. Symbolic representation served different purposes than scientific illustration, and medieval people were perfectly capable of distinguishing between the two, just as we are today. The exploration that characterized the Age of Discovery was built on medieval foundations, not a rejection of them. Technologies like the magnetic compass, astrolabe, quadrant, and improved shipbuilding techniques were all developed or refined during the medieval period. Cartography advanced significantly, with portal-on charts, navigational maps, showing remarkably accurate coastlines of Europe and the Mediterranean. Viking explorers reached North America around 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus, and Portuguese sailors systematically explored the Atlantic islands and African coast throughout the 15th century. These achievements weren't revolutionary breaks with a backward medieval worldview, but natural extensions of medieval geographic knowledge, technological development, and exploratory spirit. So why does this myth about medieval flat Earth beliefs persist so stubbornly? Partly because it's been repeated in textbooks, popular media, and even by educators who haven't kept up with historical scholarship. Partly because it reinforces satisfying narratives about the triumph of science over superstition, progress over backwardness. And partly because it allows us to feel superior to our ancestors, to imagine that we've advanced not just technologically, but intellectually beyond their childish understanding of the world. The reality that medieval scholars understood the basic shape of the Earth just fine, but worked within different paradigms and with different tools than we do, is more complex and less self-congratulatory. It requires acknowledging that intellectual progress isn't a simple linear path from ignorance to enlightenment, but a complex process built on the achievements of countless thinkers across generations. Our sixth medieval myth centers on chivalry and courtly love, those supposedly rigid codes of conduct where knights in shining armor rescued damsels in distress, fought honorably for king and country, and pined away with pure, unconsummated love for noble ladies. According to popular imagination, medieval knights were all basically Lancelot crossed with Sir Galahad, perfect gentlemen who would rather die than break their vows or behave dishonorably toward women or fellow knights. This romanticized vision of medieval chivalry is about as historically accurate as thinking modern soldiers conduct warfare according to the rules of Call of Duty. The reality of knighthood, warfare, and male-female relations in the medieval period was considerably more complex, contradictory, and often brutally pragmatic than the idealized code suggests. For starters, the chivalric code as a coherent, universal set of rules simply didn't exist in the form we imagine it. Various texts from different periods offered different advice on knightly behavior, sometimes with contradictory elements. Chivalric literature, the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, the lays of Marie de France, the tales of King Arthur and his knights, were medieval fiction, not historical documents or actual codes of conduct. They were the medieval equivalent of superhero movies, entertaining fantasies that reflected ideals and aspirations rather than everyday reality. Real medieval knights were primarily military professionals, landed aristocrats with martial training who fought for personal gain, family advancement, and political advantage as much as for abstract ideals like honor or justice. The distance between chivalric literature and actual knightly behavior was often as vast as the gap between modern action movies and real-world conflict. Medieval warfare bore little resemblance to the honorable one-on-one combat depicted in films and novels. Knights didn't typically challenge each other to single combat on the battlefield. They fought in formations, used tactical advantages wherever possible, and aimed to win by any effective means. During the 100 Years' War, English longbowmen, commoners, not knights, proved devastatingly effective against French knights at battles like Crécy and Agincourt. There was nothing dishonorable about using archers to kill enemy knights from a distance. It was simply effective tactics. Siege warfare, involving starving civilian populations into submission, was common practice. Chevauchee, the deliberate devastation of enemy territory by burning crops, destroying villages, and terrorizing peasants, was a standard strategic approach. Edward the Black Prince, often held up as a paragon of chivalry, was particularly known for this scorched earth tactic in France. Medieval warfare was brutal, pragmatic, and focused on victory, not adherence to some chivalric ideal of fair play. Even the image of the knight in shining plate armor is anachronistic for much of the medieval period. Full plate armor only developed in the 15th century, relatively late in the medieval era. Earlier knights wore mail, commonly called chainmail, a flexible armor made of interlocking metal rings, often with a padded garment underneath. The iconic jousting tournaments we associate with medieval knighthood evolved over time from relatively violent early melees that were essentially battle practice into the more ritualized, sporting events of the later Middle Ages. Early tournaments resulted in numerous deaths and injuries, with captured opponents often ransomed for significant sums. They were opportunities for profit and military training as much as for displaying chivalric virtues. The tournament as a stage for romantic display, with knights wearing ladies' favors and competing for honor rather than material gain, was more characteristic of the later medieval period and often more aspirational than reflective of common practice. The concept of courtly love, with knights dedicating their deeds to ladies and worshiping them from afar while remaining physically chaste, is largely a literary convention rather than a widespread social reality. The famous courts of love, supposedly presided over by Eleanor of Aquitaine, where ladies would judge cases of romantic conflict according to the rules of courtly love, are likely fictional or at least heavily embellished by later accounts. In reality, noble marriages were primarily political and economic arrangements, with romantic attachment considered a pleasant but unnecessary bonus. Extramarital affairs certainly occurred, but they weren't typically the idealized, platonic relationships depicted in courtly literature. They were more often pragmatic arrangements or genuine emotional attachments that existed alongside political marriages, not the anguished, unrequited pining of literary knights for unattainable ladies. The treatment of women in medieval society was far from the protective reverence suggested by chivalric ideals. While noble women often wielded significant political and economic power, particularly when managing estates during their husbands' absences, they were also legally subordinate and frequently subject to arranged marriages for political advantage. Domestic violence was not uncommon and was legally permitted within certain bounds. Women of lower social classes had even fewer protections and often faced harsh working conditions and vulnerability to exploitation. The literary ideal of the knight protecting womanhood rarely translated into systemic protections for actual women, particularly those outside the nobility. The elevation of noble women in courtly literature existed alongside legal codes and social practices that treated women as subordinate to men and primarily valuable for their reproductive and economic contributions to family interests. Even the most celebrated examples of historical knights often failed to live up to chivalric ideals. William Marshall, often cited as the greatest knight of the medieval period, built his early career by capturing and ransoming other knights for profit, essentially a form of legalized kidnapping that provided a good income for successful tournament participants. Richard the Lionheart, the epitome of the Crusader knight in popular imagination, ordered the massacre of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners after the capture of Acre during the Third Crusade, when their ransom was not paid on time. The Black Prince's aforementioned devastation of French territory hardly aligns with the ideal of the knight as protector of the innocent. These weren't exceptional lapses in otherwise chivalrous careers. They reflected the real priorities and practices of medieval warfare, where victory, profit, and political advantage typically outweighed abstract ideals of honorable conduct. Chivalric literature itself was often more complex and ambiguous than modern adaptations suggest. The stories of King Arthur and his knights frequently depicted the tensions and contradictions between different aspects of the chivalric ideal. Lancelot's legendary prowess as a knight existed in direct conflict with his adulterous relationship with Queen Guinevere. He was simultaneously the greatest knight and a betrayer of his king. The Arthurian quest for the Holy Grail resulted in the deaths of numerous knights and ultimately contributed to the fall of Camelot. These weren't simple morality tales, but complex explorations of the contradictions within medieval society and the often impossible standards set by chivalric ideals. Medieval audiences understood these stories as thought-provoking entertainment that reflected the tensions of their world, not as straightforward instructional manuals for knightly behavior. The evolution of chivalry as a concept reveals its nature as an adaptable social ideal rather than a fixed code. Early chivalric literature emphasized martial prowess and loyalty to one's lord above all else. The religious elements, defending the church and protecting the weak, became more prominent during the Crusades, when the church sought to channel knightly violence toward approved targets. The romantic aspects associated with courtly love developed primarily in the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly in French literature. By the late medieval period, chivalry had become increasingly ceremonial and performative, with elaborate tournaments and heraldic displays serving as theater for aristocratic identity rather than preparation for actual warfare. Throughout these evolutions, the gap between chivalric ideals and the reality of knightly behavior remained significant. So why has this romanticized vision of medieval chivalry persisted so strongly? The Victorian era bears much responsibility, with its Gothic revival and romanticized medievalism creating a sanitized, idealized vision of the Middle Ages that suited 19th century sensibilities. Writers like Sir Walter Scott popularized a version of medieval knighthood that aligned with Victorian values of honor, propriety, and gender virtue. This reimagined medievalism influenced everything from architecture to literature to early films, establishing visual and narrative tropes that continue to shape our perception of the period. Modern fantasy literature, Renaissance fairs, and Hollywood films have further cemented these romantic notions, creating a feedback loop where our cultural depictions of medieval chivalry reference each other rather than historical reality. The actual complexities, contradictions, and often brutal pragmatism of medieval warfare and aristocratic society make for less satisfying entertainment than the myth of the perfect knight in shining armor. Myth number 7 takes us from the battlefield to the bedroom, tackling the persistent belief that medieval people were universally prudish, sexually repressed, and governed entirely by strict religious prohibitions regarding physical pleasure. According to this popular misconception, medieval Europeans had sex exclusively for procreation, married in joyless arrangements with no concept of romantic love, and lived in constant fear of eternal damnation for even thinking about enjoying physical intimacy. The church supposedly controlled every aspect of sexual expression. Women were universally considered temptresses leading men to sin, and the entire topic of sexuality was shrouded in shame and silence. This characterization is about as accurate as claiming that modern dating consists exclusively of carefully chaperoned meetings arranged by parents. It contains tiny kernels of truth buried under mountains of misrepresentation and oversimplification. Medieval attitudes towards sexuality were indeed influenced by religious teachings, but those teachings were far more nuanced and varied than the caricature of unrelenting repression. The church did emphasize that the ideal purpose of sex was procreation within marriage, but also recognized the concept of the marriage debt, the obligation of both spouses to provide sexual satisfaction to each other as a means of preventing adultery. The 13th century theological work on the properties of things explicitly states that nature designed sexual organs for both procreation and pleasure. Medical texts discussed sexual pleasure for both men and women as a normal, natural part of human experience. The 11th century medical text, the Trotula, includes detailed advice on enhancing sexual pleasure and treating various sexual dysfunctions. These aren't the products of a culture that refused to acknowledge or discuss sexuality. They reflect a society that recognized sexual desire as a fundamental aspect of human nature, albeit one that ideally should be channeled in particular directions. Medieval literature often depicted sexuality with remarkable frankness and humor. The fabliaux, short, often ribald comic tales popular in the 12th to 14th centuries, featured explicit sexual content, clever adultery plots, and bawdy humor that would make modern cable TV blush. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales include stories like The Miller's Tale, with its infamous window-kissing scene that's essentially an elaborate fart joke combined with sexual trickery. The Wife of Bath's Tale presents a woman who openly discusses enjoying sex with her multiple husbands and advocates for female sexual autonomy. Boccaccio's Decameron contains numerous stories of sexual escapades, clever seductions, and romantic entanglements. These weren't underground or marginal works. They were mainstream entertainment enjoyed across social classes. Medieval audiences clearly appreciated sexual humor and recognized the gap between idealized religious standards and the messy reality of human desire. Contrary to the notion that medieval people married solely for political or economic advantage with no concept of romantic attachment, evidence from letters, court records, and literature shows that romantic love was well understood and valued, even if it wasn't considered a prerequisite for marriage. The 12th century letters between the philosopher Abelard and his student-turned-lover Heloise reveal a passionate relationship with both physical and intellectual dimensions. While their affair ended tragically, Abelard was castrated by Heloise's uncle after she became pregnant. Their correspondence continued for years and reflects deep emotional connection. Court records include cases of couples who defied family wishes to marry for love, sometimes facing legal consequences for their choices. The concept of marriage as a partnership involving mutual respect and affection appears in advice literature throughout the period, even as the economic and social dimensions of marriage remained primary considerations. Medieval people also found numerous ways to control reproduction that didn't involve complete sexual abstinence. Herbal contraceptives and abortifacients were widely known and used, despite official church prohibition. Texts like the 11th century De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, included information on herbs believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation. Coitus interruptus, withdrawal, was a common practice, mentioned in penitential manuals as a sin, but clearly widespread nonetheless. Various sexual positions and practices believed to reduce the likelihood of conception were discussed in medical and theological texts, usually to condemn them, but inadvertently preserving knowledge of their existence. The gap between official teaching and actual practice was substantial, with many people finding pragmatic compromises between religious ideals and the realities of sexual and reproductive life. Homosexuality in medieval Europe occupies a complex position that defies simple categorization as either accepted or universally condemned. The concept of sexual orientation as a fixed identity didn't exist in the medieval period. The focus was on acts rather than identities. Same-sex relations were officially condemned by the church, but enforcement varied dramatically by time, place, and social context. Secular laws against same-sex activity existed, but were inconsistently applied. The 14th century records of a trial in Paris describe a house where men gathered for sexual encounters, suggesting the existence of something resembling gay subculture even in this supposedly repressive era. King Edward II of England's relationship with Piers Gaveston was widely believed to be romantic and sexual in nature, and while it caused political problems, the nature of the relationship itself wasn't the primary issue. As with heterosexuality, there existed a gap between official prohibitions and the complex reality of medieval lives. The medieval church's approach to regulating sexuality was far more pragmatic than modern stereotypes suggest. While the ideal was marital sex for procreation, medieval theologians recognized human frailty and the power of sexual desire. Contrary to the notion that medieval people married solely for political or economic advantage with no concept of romantic attachment, evidence from letters, court records, and literature shows that romantic love was well understood and valued, even if it wasn't considered a prerequisite for marriage. The 12th century letters between the philosopher Abelard and his student-turned-lover Heloise reveal a passionate relationship with both physical and intellectual dimensions. While their affair ended tragically, Abelard was castrated by Heloise's uncle after she became pregnant. Their correspondence continued for years and reflects deep emotional connection. Court records include cases of couples who defied family wishes to marry for love, sometimes facing legal consequences for their choices. The concept of marriage as a partnership involving mutual respect and affection appears in advice literature throughout the period, even as the economic and social dimensions of marriage remained primary considerations. Medieval people also found numerous ways to control reproduction that didn't involve complete sexual abstinence. Herbal contraceptives and abortifacients were widely known and used, despite official church prohibition. Texts like the 11th century De Secretis Mulierum on the secrets of women included information on herbs believed to prevent conception or induce menstruation. Coitus interruptus, withdrawal, was a common practice, mentioned in penitential manuals as a sin, but clearly widespread nonetheless. Various sexual positions and practices believed to reduce the likelihood of conception were discussed in medical and theological texts, usually to condemn them, but inadvertently preserving knowledge of their existence. The gap between official teaching and actual practice was substantial, with many people finding pragmatic compromises between religious ideals and the realities of sexual and reproductive life. Homosexuality in medieval Europe occupies a complex position that defies simple categorization as either accepted or universally condemned. The concept of sexual orientation as a fixed identity didn't exist in the medieval period. The focus was on acts rather than identities. Same-sex relations were officially condemned by the church, but enforcement varied dramatically by time, place, and social context. Secular laws against same-sex activity existed, but were inconsistently applied. The 14th century records of a trial in Paris describe a house where men gathered for sexual encounters, suggesting the existence of something resembling gay subculture even in this supposedly repressive era. King Edward II of England's relationship with Piers Gaveston was widely believed to be romantic and sexual in nature, and while it caused political problems, the nature of the relationship itself wasn't the primary issue. As with heterosexuality, there existed a gap between official prohibitions and the complex reality of medieval lives. The medieval church's approach to regulating sexuality was far more pragmatic than modern stereotypes suggest. While the ideal was marital sex for procreation, medieval theologians recognized human frailty and the power of sexual desire. Confessional manuals instructed priests to consider mitigating circumstances when assigning penances for sexual sins, and to be tactful and understanding when questioning penitents about sexual matters. The concept of marriage as a remedy for concupiscence, sexual desire, acknowledged that most people couldn't maintain perfect chastity and provided a sanctioned outlet for sexual expression. Even prostitution, while officially condemned, was often tolerated as a necessary evil that prevented greater sins like rape or adultery. In many medieval cities, prostitution was regulated rather than eliminated, with designated areas where it could legally occur and sometimes even municipal-owned brothels whose profits went to the city government. Birth control and family planning strategies, while officially discouraged by the church, were widely practiced and discussed. The rhythm method, avoiding intercourse during a woman's fertile period, was known, though understanding of the female reproductive cycle was limited by the observational tools available. Extended breastfeeding, which naturally suppresses ovulation in many women, served as a form of child spacing. Herbal preparations believed to have contraceptive properties were widely used, with knowledge passed down through primarily female networks. While these methods weren't as reliable as modern contraception, they reflect a practical approach to controlling family size in a world where having too many children could lead to economic hardship or increase maternal mortality risks. Medieval people weren't blindly producing as many children as physically possible. They were making considered decisions about reproduction within the constraints of their knowledge and options. The idea that medieval people were universally ignorant about female sexuality and pleasure is contradicted by medical texts of the period. Medieval medicine, drawing on ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources, generally held that female orgasm was necessary or at least beneficial for conception. The 13th century medical work on the diseases of women states that when the woman emits her seed from the excitement of pleasure during intercourse, conception is more likely to occur. Other texts discuss the importance of foreplay and mutual satisfaction in marital relations. While these understandings weren't always scientifically accurate by modern standards, they reflect an acknowledgement of female sexual pleasure as a normal and desirable part of marital relations, not something to be suppressed or ignored. Medieval sex wasn't universally the joyless, mechanical act for procreation only that modern stereotypes suggest. So why has this myth of universal medieval sexual repression persisted? Partly because it serves a convenient narrative of historical progress, the idea that we've liberated ourselves from the sexual dark ages of the past. Partly because Victorian and early 20th century scholars who studied medieval texts often censored or glossed over sexual content, creating a sanitized version of medieval culture that aligned with their own more restrictive sexual values. And partly because focusing on official church teachings without examining how those teachings were applied in practice creates a distorted picture. The reality of medieval sexuality, like most aspects of medieval life, was complex, contradictory, and characterized by significant gaps between ideals and practices. Medieval people weren't modern individuals with modern sexual values, but neither were they universally repressed, ignorant, or joyless in their intimate relationships. Our eighth myth takes us into the castles and manors of medieval Europe to confront a persistent misconception: that medieval nobility lived in unrelenting luxury, while peasants suffered in abject misery, with no social mobility or interaction between classes. According to this oversimplified narrative, medieval society was rigidly divided between the haves and have-nots, with nobles feasting on elaborate delicacies in their comfortable castles, while peasants starved in filthy hovels with no hope of improving their condition. This stark dichotomy makes for dramatic storytelling, but poorly reflects the complex social and economic realities of medieval Europe, where class distinctions certainly existed, but were more nuanced and permeable than commonly portrayed. First, let's address the supposed luxury of medieval noble life. While aristocrats certainly enjoyed privileges and comforts unavailable to commoners, medieval castles were far from the comfortable, palatial settings depicted in many films and television shows. Early medieval castles were primarily military structures designed for defense, not comfort or aesthetic appeal. They were often cold, drafty, and dark, with limited privacy even for noble occupants. Rushes, dried plants, strewn on floors needed frequent changing to manage the accumulation of dirt, food scraps, and waste from humans and any animals kept inside during sieges. Smoke from open hearths filled the air, as chimneys only became common in the later medieval period. Bathing facilities were limited, and even private latrines were a luxury. While later medieval manors and palaces introduced more comfortable features like glass windows, better heating systems, and more private spaces, they still lacked many basic amenities we consider essential for comfortable living today. The diet of the nobility, while more varied and abundant than that of peasants, wasn't consistently lavish or excessive. Outside of special feasts and celebrations, noble meals were often relatively simple by modern standards. Fresh meat was available more regularly to nobles than to peasants, but preservation methods were limited and food safety was a constant concern. Noble households experienced seasonal variations in food availability just as peasant families did, though with better reserves to weather lean periods. The spectacular feasts depicted in films, with tables groaning under endless platters of exotic foods, were special occasions, not daily reality. These elaborate meals served important social and political functions, demonstrating wealth and generosity to forge alliances and maintain status. But they were exceptional events rather than standard fare. The everyday noble diet, while privileged, wasn't as extravagantly different from peasant food as commonly imagined. Medieval nobles faced health challenges and dangers that their wealth and status couldn't entirely mitigate. They suffered from the same diseases as commoners, with limited effective medical treatments available regardless of social standing. Childbirth was dangerous for women of all classes, with maternal mortality rates high even among the nobility. Political violence was a constant threat for high-status individuals who could be targeted during wars, rebellions, or court intrigues. Tournament injuries and hunting accidents claimed the lives of many nobles. Military service, expected of the aristocratic class, carried significant risks. Being noble provided better nutrition, living conditions, and access to the best medical care available. But these advantages offered only marginal protection against the primary health threats of the era. The medieval nobility's privilege didn't translate to anything resembling modern standards of health, safety, or comfort. On the other side of the social divide, the medieval peasantry wasn't a homogeneous mass of uniformly impoverished, miserable serfs. Significant stratification existed within rural communities, from relatively prosperous yeoman farmers who might own substantial land to poor cottagers with minimal holdings. By the later medieval period, particularly after the population decline caused by the Black Death created labor shortages, many peasants had secured greater economic opportunities and improved legal standing. The percentage of unfree serfs declined over time in most regions, with various forms of tenant farming and wage labor becoming more common. Successful peasant farmers could accumulate significant wealth, build substantial houses, and enjoy diets that, while different from noble fare, were adequate and sometimes abundant, particularly in regions with fertile land and good growing conditions. Social mobility in medieval Europe was more possible than commonly portrayed, though certainly more limited than in modern societies. The most established pathway for advancement was through the church, where individuals of modest birth could rise to positions of significant power and influence based on education and ability. Pope Gregory VII, one of the most powerful medieval popes, came from a humble background. Education, typically beginning with church schools, offered opportunities for talented commoners to become clerks, administrators, or scholars. The growing commercial economy, particularly in urban areas, created another avenue for advancement as successful merchants and craftsmen accumulated wealth that sometimes eclipsed that of minor nobility. By the later medieval period, wealthy urban families could purchase rural estates and eventually marry into the aristocracy, beginning the multi-generational process of becoming new nobility. The military profession also offered possibilities for social advancement, particularly during the 100 Years' War and similar extended conflicts. The English longbowman John Hawkwood began as a common soldier, but eventually became a successful mercenary captain in Italy, was knighted, and died wealthy and respected. William Marshall, mentioned earlier as the greatest knight, was a younger son of a minor noble who rose to become Earl of Pembroke and Regent of England through his military skill and political acumen. While these dramatic rises were exceptional rather than typical, they demonstrate that medieval society wasn't as rigidly stratified as often portrayed. Merit, luck, patronage, and opportunity could combine to elevate individuals beyond their birth station, even if such advancement was more difficult and rare than in modern meritocratic systems. The relationship between medieval nobles and peasants wasn't simply one of oppressor and oppressed, but involved complex networks of mutual obligation and dependence. The manorial system, while certainly designed to benefit the landowning class, included reciprocal responsibilities. Lords provided protection, maintained infrastructure like mills and bridges, and were expected to assist during famines or other crises. Peasants owed labor service and a portion of their production, but also had recognized rights within the system. Local courts, while biased toward elite interests, nevertheless provided forums where peasants could bring complaints against lords who violated customary agreements. Successful agricultural production required cooperation between classes, creating practical incentives for maintaining workable relationships. This wasn't equality or freedom in the modern sense. But neither was it the simple tyranny of unrestrained power often depicted in popular media. Medieval peasant communities maintained considerable autonomy in many aspects of daily life, developing sophisticated systems of self-governance alongside manorial obligations. Village councils made decisions about agricultural practices, managed common resources like pastures and woodlands, and resolved local disputes. Customary law protected peasant rights to land usage and inheritance, with these traditions often documented and defended when challenged. Guilds in market towns and cities provided frameworks for artisans and traders to regulate their professions and advocate collectively for their interests. Peasant revolts, while usually unsuccessful in achieving their immediate aims, demonstrated that rural communities could organize to resist perceived injustices and sometimes secured concessions from authorities. The medieval peasantry wasn't a passive, voiceless mass, but an active participant in economic and social systems with the capacity for collective action. The urban centers of medieval Europe created spaces where the rigid distinctions of rural feudal society became more fluid and complex. Cities operated under different legal frameworks, with many offering freedom from servile obligations to those who resided within their walls for a year and a day. Statluft mocked free. City air makes you free. Guilds provided structures for apprentices to become masters based on skill rather than birth, creating pathways for advancement within trades. Merchant wealth created a proto-middle class that didn't fit neatly into the traditional three-estate model of medieval society. Those who pray, those who fight, those who work. Universities established in urban centers offered educational opportunities based partially on ability rather than exclusively on family background. While medieval cities weren't modern democracies, they created alternative social structures where talent, wealth, and opportunity could sometimes override birth status. The popular image of the medieval noble as an idle parasite living luxuriously off peasant labor misrepresents the actual economic and administrative functions of the aristocracy. Managing large estates required considerable knowledge and skill. Nobles served as military leaders, judicial authorities, and administrative officials, roles essential to medieval governance. They patronized churches, monasteries, and hospitals, contributing to the period's religious and charitable infrastructure. While the distribution of power and wealth heavily favored the elite, medieval nobles weren't simply consuming resources without providing services in return. They performed necessary functions within the social and political systems of their time. The modern concept of the idle rich maps poorly onto medieval reality, where wealth derived primarily from land required active management and entailed specific responsibilities rather than simply generating passive income. So why has this oversimplified vision of medieval class relations persisted? Partly because the stark contrast between extreme wealth and extreme poverty creates dramatic tension useful for storytelling. Partly because focusing on the extremes of the social spectrum ignores the complex middle layers that don't fit neatly into binary narratives. And partly because viewing medieval society as irredeemably unequal and oppressive allows us to congratulate ourselves on our supposed modern progress towards social justice, rather than recognizing the complex ways that inequality and opportunity have evolved rather than disappeared. The reality of medieval class relations, with its mixture of hierarchy and mobility, exploitation and mutual dependence, rigid structures and individual exceptions, offers fewer clear moral lessons, but a much richer understanding of how societies organize themselves when facing the constraints and possibilities of their particular historical moment. Myth number 9 brings us to a particularly persistent medieval misconception: the idea that the Middle Ages was a uniformly religious era where the Catholic Church controlled every aspect of life, skepticism or scientific thinking was impossible, and everyone from peasants to kings lived in constant fear of hellfire and damnation. According to this popular view, medieval Europeans were universally pious, superstitious, and intellectually constrained by religious dogma, with the church serving as an omnipresent thought police that crushed any hint of independent thinking. This characterization is about as nuanced as claiming that modern life is entirely defined by smartphone use. It takes one significant aspect of medieval culture and inflates it to eclipse all other dimensions of human experience during a 1,000-year period across an entire continent. Medieval religiosity was indeed more public and institutionally embedded than in most modern Western societies, but it varied enormously in its expression, intensity, and impact on daily life. Church attendance was expected, but not universally practiced with equal devotion. Parish records and bishops' visitation reports frequently lament spotty attendance, inappropriate behavior during services, and general religious laxity among portions of the population. Seasonal religious observance was common, attending church on major feast days while being less diligent during ordinary times. Some communities had to be threatened with fines to ensure attendance. Medieval people, like humans in all eras, exhibited a spectrum of religious engagement from the deeply devout to the nominally observant to the skeptical or indifferent. The image of the medieval peasant trembling in constant religious fear represents the exceptional rather than the typical experience. Dissent and criticism within the medieval church were far more common than popular misconceptions suggest. The period witnessed numerous reform movements that explicitly criticized clerical corruption, theological errors, or institutional failures. The Franciscans began as a radical movement challenging ecclesiastical wealth. John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia developed critiques of church practices that anticipated many Protestant Reformation arguments. The Western Schism of 1378 to 1417, when rival popes simultaneously claimed authority, severely undermined papal prestige and prompted widespread questioning of church structures. Lay religious movements like the Beguines created space for spiritual expression outside traditional ecclesiastical control. These weren't marginal phenomena, but significant movements that engaged substantial portions of the population. Medieval Christianity wasn't a monolithic, unchanging institution, but a dynamic tradition with internal debates, competing interpretations, and ongoing reform efforts. Medieval humor frequently targeted religious figures and practices, suggesting a comfortable irreverence rather than uniform pious deference. Stories about lustful monks, corrupt priests, and greedy bishops were popular entertainment across social classes. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales include sharp satire of religious hypocrisy, with characters like the corrupt pardoner and the gluttonous friar presented for comedic effect. Church authorities themselves sometimes permitted ritualized inversion of religious hierarchy, as in the Feast of Fools celebrations where lower clergy would temporarily assume leadership roles and parody religious ceremonies. These weren't necessarily expressions of disbelief, but rather indicated a religious culture secure enough to accommodate humor and criticism within certain bounds. Medieval people could simultaneously believe in Christian doctrines while laughing at institutional failings and human foibles within the church, much like modern believers who joke about aspects of their religious traditions without rejecting the faith entirely. The actual enforcement of religious conformity varied dramatically by time, place, and specific issue. The notorious Spanish Inquisition, often cited as evidence of medieval religious repression, was actually established in 1478, very late in the medieval period, and reflected specific political circumstances rather than typical medieval practice. Earlier inquisitorial procedures were usually more limited and focused on specific heresies in particular regions. Local religious practice often incorporated pre-Christian elements or regional variations that technically deviated from official doctrine but were tolerated by local clergy. Parish priests, many of whom came from the same communities they served and had limited theological education, often emphasized practical morality over doctrinal precision. While certain boundaries existed beyond which heterodoxy became dangerous, within those boundaries existed considerable space for variation, personal interpretation, and even selective non-compliance with aspects of official teaching. Scientific thinking and religious belief coexisted rather than conflicted for most medieval scholars. As mentioned earlier when discussing the Dark Ages myth, medieval universities were centers of intellectual inquiry in fields including mathematics, optics, astronomy, and medicine. These investigations occurred within a framework that assumed divine creation but sought to understand the natural mechanisms through which God's world operated. Roger Bacon, Robert Grosseteste, Nicole Oersma, and other medieval thinkers developed observational methodologies and experimental approaches that contributed to the foundations of modern science. The university curriculum included study of Aristotle and other ancient philosophers whose works encouraged systematic investigation of natural phenomena. The church generally supported rather than hindered this scholarship, with most universities operating under ecclesiastical charters and many leading scientific thinkers being clerics themselves. The supposed conflict between science and religion is largely a modern narrative retroactively imposed on the medieval period. Medieval people maintained a practical skepticism about certain religious claims, even while accepting the broader framework of Christian belief. Miracle stories were not uncritically accepted by all. Hagiographies, saints' lives, often include accounts of witnesses demanding proof or testing miracle claims before accepting them. Church authorities themselves established investigative procedures for validating reported miracles, requiring multiple witnesses and examining alternative explanations. Pilgrimage sites competed for visitors with increasingly elaborate miracle claims, leading to a market-like environment where extraordinary assertions required compelling evidence to attract believers. While the conceptual framework for evaluating such claims differed from modern scientific standards, medieval people weren't universally credulous or incapable of critical thinking when confronted with extraordinary religious assertions. They applied practical reason and experience-based judgment within their cultural context, much as people do today. The relationship between secular and religious authority in medieval Europe was characterized by ongoing negotiation and conflict rather than simple church dominance. The investiture controversy of the 11th to 12th centuries, when emperors and popes battled over who could appoint bishops, reflected the contested boundaries between spiritual and temporal power. Kings frequently defied papal directives when these conflicted with royal interests, sometimes suffering excommunication, but often eventually reaching pragmatic compromises. The development of canon law, church law, alongside various secular legal codes created parallel jurisdictions with complex interactions rather than a single, church-dominated legal system. Even during periods of strong papal authority, practical governance remained primarily in secular hands, with religious institutions serving as one power center among others rather than an overarching controlling force. The medieval political landscape was more pluralistic than the stereotype of church-dominated society suggests. Daily life for most medieval people wasn't characterized by constant religious activity or anxiety. While the liturgical calendar marked the year with feasts and fasts, and religious rituals accompanied major life events, much of ordinary existence focused on practical concerns of work, family, and community. Agricultural cycles, market days, and seasonal tasks structured time alongside religious observances. Village conflicts centered on land usage, property boundaries, and personal disputes more often than theological questions. Urban records show citizens primarily concerned with commerce, craft production, and civic governance. Religious practice was integrated into these activities rather than replacing or dominating them. The medieval person worried about crop yields, family sustenance, and local politics alongside salvation. Their religious identity was one significant aspect of life rather than its all-consuming focus. Medieval entertainment and leisure activities frequently had secular rather than religious content. While mystery plays depicting biblical stories were popular, so were secular narratives of romance, adventure, and comedy. Music and dance, though sometimes condemned by religious authorities as occasions for sin, remained widespread and often distinctly non-religious in character. Board games, physical sports, and various gambling activities provided recreation despite occasional clerical disapproval. Seasonal festivals combined religious elements with clearly pre-Christian traditions and abundant opportunities for eating, drinking, and courtship. Even within religious contexts like pilgrimage, non-spiritual motivations like tourism, social opportunity, and escape from routine often played significant roles. Medieval leisure wasn't solely focused on religious edification, but encompassed the full range of human interests in entertainment, socialization, and pleasure-seeking, much like leisure in any era. So why has this myth of uniform medieval piety and church control persisted? Partly because religious institutions produced and preserved most of the written records from the period, creating a sampling bias that overrepresents religious perspectives and concerns. Partly because Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinkers constructed narratives of progress that required portraying the medieval period as dominated by superstition and religious control to highlight their own supposed rationality and freedom. And partly because modern secular societies often find it difficult to imagine a world where religious and secular aspects of life were more integrated without assuming that this integration meant the complete subordination of all other concerns to religious authority. The reality of medieval religious life, with its mixture of devotion and pragmatism, institutional power and popular adaptation, official doctrine and local practice, offers a more complex picture of how societies incorporate religious dimensions without being wholly defined or controlled by them. Our 10th and final myth brings everything full circle as we examine the persistent misconception that the medieval period was entirely disconnected from the present, a bizarre, alien era with no relevance to modern life beyond providing fantasy settings for movies and games. According to this view, medieval people were fundamentally different from us in their thinking, values, and experiences, making their world incomprehensibly foreign to modern sensibilities. The Middle Ages becomes either a dark cautionary tale about everything we've thankfully left behind, or a romanticized wonderland of knights and castles with no meaningful connection to contemporary reality. This perspective misses the profound ways medieval institutions, innovations, and cultural patterns continue to shape our world, and how examining the period on its own terms reveals surprisingly familiar human experiences beneath the surface differences. Universities, those centers of higher learning where millions of modern students pursue degrees, are direct institutional descendants of medieval origins. The University of Bologna, founded 1088, University of Oxford, established by 1096, University of Paris, founded around 1150, and other early universities pioneered educational structures we still recognize today. Degree programs, faculty governance, academic departments, lectures, and disputations, the medieval version of seminars. Academic regalia worn at modern graduation ceremonies derives from medieval scholarly garb. The concept of academic disciplines, the practice of peer review, and the basic format of scholarly publication all have medieval roots. When today's professor publishes research in a peer-reviewed journal, they're participating in a knowledge creation and verification process with direct medieval antecedents, even if the specific content and methodologies have evolved dramatically. Modern academic life remains structured around medieval institutional frameworks that have proven remarkably durable and adaptable across centuries. Our legal systems, particularly in common law countries like the United States and United Kingdom, build directly on medieval foundations. The concept of due process, trial by jury, the right to legal representation, and protection against arbitrary imprisonment emerged during the medieval period. The Magna Carta of 1215, though initially a feudal document securing baronial privileges against royal power, established principles that evolved into fundamental concepts of constitutional government and individual rights. English common law, developed through medieval court decisions and legal commentaries like those of Henry de Bracton in the 13th century, remains the basis for legal systems across the former British Empire, including the United States. When modern courts cite precedent or attorneys make arguments based on case law, they're employing a methodological approach pioneered in medieval legal thinking. Even civil law systems based on comprehensive legal codes trace significant elements to medieval Roman law as revived and systematized at the University of Bologna in the 11th to 12th centuries. Democratic governance and representative institutions, while certainly transformed over centuries, have medieval origins that continue to influence modern political structures. England's parliament evolved from the medieval Great Council, with the House of Commons gradually gaining power as representatives of non-noble interests. Similar representative assemblies developed across medieval Europe, including the Spanish Cortes, the French Estates General, and various town councils and regional assemblies. These weren't democracies in the modern sense. Representation was based on estates or corporate groups rather than individual citizens, and participation was limited, but they established the principle that rulers should consult with representatives of the governed, particularly on matters of taxation. The basic concept of representative government rather than absolute monarchy or pure direct democracy has medieval roots, even as the specifics of who is represented and how have expanded dramatically in modern democratic systems. Financial and economic institutions that form the backbone of modern capitalism emerged during the medieval period. Banking systems developed in Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, with innovations including double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and insurance contracts. The commenda, a medieval investment arrangement where one party provided capital and another handled operations with profits divided according to predetermined percentages, was an early form of limited liability partnership. Medieval merchant guilds pioneered concepts of corporate identity separate from individual members. Universities and monasteries developed sophisticated accounting practices for managing institutional resources. Markets, while obviously existing in earlier periods, acquired more formal regulation and physical infrastructure during the medieval period, with specialized commercial spaces and standardized weights and measures. When modern businesses balance their books, issue shares, or purchase insurance, they're utilizing financial instruments with medieval origins. Technological innovations from the medieval period continue to influence our lives, often invisibly because they become so thoroughly integrated into the modern world. The mechanical clock developed in European monasteries during the 13th to 14th centuries fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with time, shifting from natural rhythms to standardized hours. Our modern obsession with precisely measured time descends directly from this medieval innovation. Eyeglasses, first developed in Italy around the late 13th century, revolutionized access to reading and fine work for aging populations. The printing press with movable type, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, late medieval period, transformed information sharing and standardization of knowledge in ways that anticipated modern mass media and digital communication revolutions. Medieval innovations in agricultural technology, textile production, water power, and metallurgy created foundations for later industrial developments. The technological distance between us and the Middle Ages is vast, but connects through an unbroken chain of innovations rather than representing a complete break with the medieval past. Cultural practices and social institutions we take for granted often have direct medieval antecedents. Modern hospitals evolved from medieval institutions that combine medical care with spiritual services. Charitable organizations continuing contemporary traditions of philanthropy and social welfare derive from medieval religious foundations dedicated to caring for the poor, sick, and vulnerable. Universities, as previously mentioned, maintain direct institutional continuity with their medieval origins. The concept of the corporation as a legal entity separate from its individual members developed in medieval law. Even seemingly modern social phenomena, like celebrity culture, have medieval parallels in the fame of renowned knights, saints, or scholars whose reputations spread through networks of communication analogous to modern media. These continuities don't mean that medieval and modern institutions are identical. They've evolved significantly, but they reveal ongoing lineages rather than complete historical ruptures. Perhaps most importantly, medieval people themselves were recognizably human in ways that transcend the cultural and technological differences separating their world from ours. They formed emotional attachments, worried about their children's futures, squabbled with neighbors, took pride in their work, enjoyed entertainment, and questioned their place in the universe. Letters between medieval family members express love, concern, and everyday updates that would be immediately recognizable to modern readers despite the centuries between them. Guild records show craftspeople taking pride in quality workmanship and complaining about unfair competition. Court cases reveal property disputes, petty jealousies, and family conflicts that could easily occur in modern contexts with only superficial details changed. While medieval people understood their world through different conceptual frameworks than we typically employ, the fundamental human experiences of love, grief, ambition, anxiety, joy, and contemplation transcend these historical and cultural differences. The medieval world's connection to modernity isn't simply about institutional continuities or technological lineages, but about recognizing how examining the past on its own terms provides perspective on our present. Studying medieval approaches to community, sustainability, spirituality, craftsmanship, and other aspects of human experience offers alternative models that can illuminate assumptions embedded in modern systems. Medieval urban planning prioritized walkability and mixed-use spaces in ways that modern urban designers are now rediscovering as more sustainable and community-oriented than 20th century car center development. Medieval craft production emphasizes quality, durability, and skilled labor in contrast to modern disposable consumer culture. Medieval conceptions of time, less rigidly scheduled and more responsive to natural rhythms, offer perspective on our modern time scarcity and productivity obsessions. These aren't arguments for returning to medieval practices, but recognition that historical alternatives can provide critical perspective on aspects of modernity we might otherwise take for granted as inevitable or universal. Of course, significant differences between medieval and modern worlds exist and should be acknowledged rather than minimized. Medical knowledge, technology, political rights, gender equality, religious freedom, and countless other aspects of life have transformed dramatically over the centuries, generally, though not universally, in directions most modern people would consider improvements. The point isn't to romanticize the medieval period or suggest equivalence between medieval and modern conditions, but to recognize the complex relationship between past and present that includes both continuities and ruptures. The medieval world wasn't an entirely alien realm disconnected from our experience, nor was it simply an earlier version of modern society with a few superficial differences. It was its own complex civilization with distinctive characteristics, while also forming part of the ongoing human story that connects directly to our contemporary world. So why has this myth of complete disconnection between medieval and modern worlds persisted? Partly because emphasizing historical discontinuity allows both romanticism and condescension toward the past. We can either yearn nostalgically for an imagined, simpler time or congratulate ourselves on our supposed progress and sophistication. Partly because acknowledging continuities complicates triumphalist narratives about modernity representing a complete break with a benighted past. And partly because popular media finds it easier to present the Middle Ages as a generic fantasy setting rather than engaging with its complex realities and connections to the present. Recognizing the medieval period as neither completely alien nor simply an earlier version of our own society requires a more nuanced historical understanding than popular culture typically encourages. As we conclude our journey through these 10 medieval myths, perhaps the most important takeaway is not just correcting specific misconceptions, but recognizing how these persistent myths reflect our own relationship with history. Why do we need to believe that medieval people never bathed, died young, ate bland food, thought the earth was flat, and lived in unrelenting religious fear and class oppression? Perhaps because these beliefs allow us to construct a narrative of historical progress that flatters our modern sensibilities. If the past was uniformly terrible, then the present must represent improvement rather than simply difference. If medieval people were fundamentally unlike us, dirtier, more superstitious, less sophisticated, then we can avoid seeing ourselves reflected in their struggles, compromises, and contradictions. The good news is that the medieval period was a complex, fascinating era filled with innovation, beauty, humor, and recognizably human experiences that connect directly to our modern world in countless ways. The bad news is that correcting these myths requires giving up simplistic narratives about historical progress and acknowledging that our ancestors weren't fundamentally different from us in their basic humanity, even while living in radically different circumstances. The medieval period wasn't a dark age of ignorance and misery, nor was it a romantic wonderland of noble knights and simple pleasures. It was a 1,000-year span of human civilization, with all the complexity, contradiction, beauty, cruelty, wisdom, and folly that entails. By understanding it on its own terms rather than through the distorting lens of persistent myths, we gain not just historical accuracy, but deeper insight into our own world and its connections to the past that shaped it. We can laugh at medieval misconceptions while recognizing that future generations will likely find our own beliefs and practices equally amusing or perplexing. Our descendants might marvel at how we willingly carry devices that tracked our every movement while worrying about privacy, or how we continued environmentally destructive practices despite knowing their consequences, or how we organized our entire lives around abstract concepts like money and career advancement. They might find our medical practices barbaric, our educational systems inefficient, and our social arrangements as arbitrary and unjustified as we find medieval feudalism. The conceit that we've reached the pinnacle of human development and rationality is one that every civilization has indulged in, and one that history consistently proves wrong. This perspective isn't meant to promote relativism or suggest that all historical periods are equally desirable to live in. Few would choose medieval medical care over modern treatments, or prefer medieval justice systems to contemporary legal protections. Rather, it encourages humility about our own era's assumptions and recognition that progress isn't a simple, linear path, but a complex process with gains, losses, and unintended consequences. Medieval people weren't waiting around for modernity to rescue them from their terrible lives. They were actively creating, innovating, loving, fighting, and building within their own cultural frameworks and technological constraints, just as we do today within ours. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from examining medieval myths is learning to question the oversimplified historical narratives we've absorbed from popular culture. When we recognize that medieval people didn't actually believe the earth was flat or live in perpetual filth and misery, we might begin questioning other historical facts we've accepted without examination. This critical approach to the past isn't just an academic exercise, but a practical skill for navigating a present filled with simplified, politically motivated historical claims. Understanding how medieval myths developed and persisted despite contradicting historical evidence helps us recognize similar processes of myth-making about other historical periods and even current events. So what does this journey through medieval myths tell us about ourselves? Why do these particular misconceptions persist so stubbornly in our collective imagination? One possibility is that they serve psychological functions beyond mere historical ignorance. The myth of medieval filth allows us to feel superior about modern hygiene without examining our own environmentally problematic cleanliness standards. The myth of universal early death helps us avoid confronting our own mortality by framing longevity as a modern achievement rather than the human norm. The myth of bland food justifies our contemporary over-reliance on salt, sugar, and fat by suggesting previous alternatives were unpalatable. Each myth provides comfortable distance from aspects of human experience we find challenging or uncomfortable. These medieval myths also serve narratives about progress that are central to modern identity. If the medieval period was uniformly terrible, then the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and Industrial Revolution can be framed as unambiguous improvements rather than complex transformations with both positive and negative aspects. The mythology of a dark, ignorant medieval era provides a convenient backdrop against which to project modern accomplishments, without acknowledging the aspects of medieval life: community cohesion, sustainable resource use, integration of work and meaning, that might challenge contemporary practices. By flattening the medieval period into a caricature, we avoid the more difficult task of engaging with its actual complexities and the questions they might raise about our own civilization. The persistence of medieval myths reflects our contemporary relationship with history more broadly. In an era of unprecedented access to historical information, many prefer simplified narratives that confirm existing beliefs rather than challenging them. We consume history as entertainment, in films, television shows, and games, without engaging with the scholarly work that provides more accurate and nuanced understandings of the past. Academic historians often struggle to communicate their findings to broader audiences in accessible ways that could displace entrenched misconceptions. The gap between popular and scholarly understandings of history has perhaps never been wider, despite, or perhaps because of, the proliferation of history-themed media. Consider how frequently we encounter medieval settings and themes in contemporary culture. Fantasy literature and television, Renaissance fairs, medieval-themed restaurants and entertainment venues, video games set in pseudo-medieval worlds. These commercial adaptations of medieval elements typically reinforce rather than challenge common misconceptions, creating a feedback loop where inaccurate depictions seem authentic because they match our expectations, which themselves were formed by previous inaccurate depictions. Breaking this cycle requires active engagement with historical scholarship rather than passive consumption of medievalist entertainment, a shift that requires effort but offers richer understanding and appreciation of both past and present. The good news is that accurate information about medieval life is more accessible than ever before. University courses, scholarly books, museum exhibitions, historical reenactment groups with research-based approaches, and digital humanities projects all offer windows into the actual medieval world beyond the myths. Organizations like the Medieval Academy of America and the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship produce research that continually deepens our understanding of this complex period. Public historians and educators work to translate academic findings into accessible formats for broader audiences. These resources allow anyone with curiosity about the medieval past to move beyond Hollywood simplifications toward more nuanced and accurate understanding. The bad news is that myth-busting alone isn't enough to change entrenched misconceptions. Cognitive research shows that simply presenting correct information rarely displaces existing beliefs, particularly when those beliefs serve psychological or ideological functions beyond mere factual understanding. More effective approaches involve connecting accurate historical information to contemporary concerns, acknowledging the emotional appeal of medieval myths while gently correcting them, and creating compelling alternative narratives that are both accurate and engaging. The challenge isn't just providing correct information about medieval bathing practices or scientific knowledge, but helping people understand why these corrections matter for our understanding of both past and present. As you consider these debunked medieval myths, I invite you to reflect on what other historical periods might be similarly misrepresented in your mental landscape. What do you know about ancient Egypt, Imperial China, pre-Columbian America, or countless other civilizations that might actually be simplified myths rather than historical realities? How might questioning these received facts open new perspectives on human experience across time and space? History at its best isn't about memorizing dates and names, but about developing the capacity to imagine other ways of being human, to recognize both the differences that make past societies distinct and the commonalities that connect us across centuries. The medieval period, stripped of its mythological trappings, offers particularly rich territory for this kind of imaginative engagement. Its thousand-year span encompasses enormous diversity and change, from the collapse of Western Roman imperial structures to the early Renaissance, from Viking explorations to the rise of universities, from early feudalism to proto-capitalist trading networks. It witnessed technological innovations, artistic achievements, philosophical developments, and social experiments that continue to influence our world. By engaging with this complexity rather than dismissing it as a dark age or romanticizing it as a simpler time, we gain not just historical knowledge, but perspective on our own moment in the ongoing human story. So next time you hear someone casually repeat one of these medieval myths about filthy peasants or flat earth beliefs or bland food or universal early death, perhaps gently offer correction, not to show off superior knowledge, but to invite them into a richer understanding of the past and its connection to our present. The actual Middle Ages, with all its complexity, contradiction, and creativity, offers far more interesting material for conversation than the simplified caricature that persists in popular imagination. And who knows, you might find yourself becoming a medieval mythbuster too, helping others appreciate the fascinating reality behind the persistent fictions we've inherited about this pivotal period in human history. Well, unless you truly believe that people in the 1300s thought they might sail off the edge of the world, or that knights in shining armor spent their days rescuing damsels tied to railway tracks. In that case, I have a lovely, authentic medieval castle in Brooklyn I'd be happy to sell you, complete with its own dragon in the dungeon and a round table where King Arthur himself once spilled mead on his brand new suit of plate armor. Just don't ask too many questions about the historical accuracy. That would spoil all the fun, wouldn't it?